So, in upcoming FamiThon episodes, I'm going to be dealing with some pretty terrible games. So, to slow the poison, I'm going to do a little something different. We all know the Famicom/NES was a ginormous smash in both the US and Japan, but that doesn't mean there wasn't some competition. Of course, one arcade manufacturer and developer, Sega, had many hits under their belt. Head-On, Monaco GP, and Zaxxon, to name a few. But over time, their arcade sales started to slip and needed an alternative revenue. At the time in Japan, nowhere to be seen with video game consoles. At most were Pong consoles, one of the most successful being the color TV game 15 by Nintendo. And there were plenty of American companies successful with home consoles, so why not start a Japanese market? Well, actually, they weren't starting the console market. The original console's plan was to be a home computer called the SG-1000, but upon seeing Nintendo's Famicom, they decided to base the computer into a console, and the SG-1000 was born. Yeah, it wouldn't be the last time Sega copied Nintendo, as we'll see later this episode. Look at that console. That just screams Sega, doesn't it? The controller, however, were more of, how you say, of the time. It resembled an Intellivision ColecoVision controller, but with no number pads, instead a joystick and two buttons on the side. Very strange. The SG-1000 was released in 1983 and managed to get 21 games out by the end of the year. The Famicom? Only 8. Now, before we go congratulating Sega for their amazing output, let's take a look at some of the games released in 1983. First, we have Borderline, a port of Sega's 1980 arcade game, done by shoot-'em-up experts Compile as one of their first works ever, and would make a few other titles on the SG-1000. And it's a pretty latent shoot-'em-up with a car that's pretty hard to connect with the enemies, and eventually you'll fight tanks while mowing grass. Moving on. Another Sega arcade port was Congo Bongo, notably similar to Donkey Kong. However, the original game was in an isometric perspective, which really wouldn't work on the SG-1000, so now the first level is pretty much Donkey Kong. But the second level is more about traversing a maze. This is probably one of the best looking SG-1000 games, but man, the second level can get annoying to play. I hate these snakes. There was a port of Sega's huge Monaco GP. Racing games were a pretty big deal back then, compared to what we have now. Mario Kart, is Gran Turismo still around? Yeah. Car, a game resembling Sega's Head-On, but being more like Pac-Man. Much like Pac-Man was Sinbad's Adventure, where you push rocks on enemies. Not too bad. But Sega was not only cool porting their own titles to the new console, but other companies' games as well, such as Galaga, and they do a pretty good job. So Sega got a game that wouldn't be released on the Famicom for another 2 years. I guess that's a positive. Also Jaleco games such as Pop Flamer, a game where a mouse has fire-breathing abilities and burns other animals. Sadly not ported onto the SG-1000 well. One game that was Exerion. Remember this? Pretty good port despite sharing the same problems of the Famicom version. And finally Zip Race by Irem. Ironically the next game I need to review that I'm trying to avoid. And spoiler alert, it's that much better. In terms of original content, Space Solemn is a game where you solemn with your spaceship through flags. It was developed by a company called Orca, and that's all I know. Now for some sports titles. Championship Baseball is the first in SG's sports series, and is on par with Nintendo's Baseball from the same year. But Championship Tennis and Golf are another story. Despite coming out before Nintendo's titles, tennis lacks a good sense of speed on your character, and golf lacks Nintendo's new golfing system, so of course it's going to be an archaic time. But don't forget, Japanese public, of the Mahjong, Shogi, and Pachinko titles. Hey, fun fact, Sega actually makes more off their Pachinko machines than their actual game. One more original title was Sega Flipper. This one is night and day compared to pinball and NES. Thanks to Satoru Iwata's amazing skill of coding a pinball game, Sega Flipper feels like I'm playing pinball with a rock. There were other titles released in '83, but those are the ones that are really worth talking about. But still some big name Sega titles, other big name titles, some sports entertainment games, looking very impressive. So Sega was all set to make a success with the SG-1000. But the only problem is that on the exact same day, in June 16th, 1983, Nintendo also released their new console for the Japanese market, the Family Computer. And reportedly, while the SG-1000 had a good enough year in 83, by 84 the console was completely hopeless, pretty much due to the fact Nintendo's hardware was technologically superior in almost every way, especially this new ability, smoothly scrolling between scenes. Could the SG-1000 do that? Maybe if they tried hard enough. Not to mention in 1983, the SG-3000 would have some tough competition against the newly released MSX computer by Microsoft Japan, released, guess what, the exact same day. So no matter what Sega would do, the SG-1000 and the SG-3000 would be completely hopeless. Sega got the idea to sort of fix the console's problems, and in 1984 introduced the SG-1002, a revised console to be superior to the SG-1000, also with a controller redesigned to look eerily similar to a Famicom controller. Except what's this? A stick on a D-pad? Unlike 1983, Sega got the idea of quality over quantity and reduced 21 games to 11. Let's have a look. Flicky is a name you might be aware of if you played Sonic. It supported the arcade game of the same name and would later be remade into Sonic 3D Blast. This would be a pretty good port if the sprite flicker wasn't so bad. Flicky? More like Flicker. But anyways, one of the better games on the SG-1000. Load Runner. Of course it had to be Load Runner. Sadly not as graphically stunning as the NES version, but makes up for it with its nice sense of speed on the characters. Well, until you get to level 2, where the enemy's placement will get you frustrated. Other than those two, the rest are original titles, starting with Girl Garden, one of the best SG-1000 games and well known as the first game Yuji Naka worked on for Sega. Naka would end up making some game about a rodent for Sega later. I think it was Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel. Joking aside, this game has you playing as Papyri, who must stop her boyfriend, Minto, from going to another girl named Coco. So to get his love back, she must pick 10 flowers and bring them to his house. Not sure why a little boy would want flowers, but okay. And what's this? Wedding music? A little too sudden for that now, isn't it? Papyri must avoid the bears who just wander around this neighborhood. Luckily you got some honey that can distract him. When you lose a life, there's this nice little animation of a heart flying towards you. The quality really shines in this game. Now, while this is one of the best SG-1000 games, you gotta remember that SG quality is different from Famicom quality. If this was on the Famicom, I'd say it's a decent game, but on the SG-1000 where quality varies, hell yeah, best game ever. I mean, compared to the 2 licensed game in 1984, it definitely stands out. You might be familiar with the spy manga Golgo 13 and the 2 NES games it got. Well, here's a strange save the fugitives on a train by shooting small as hell windows to release them. If you can't tell, that's its biggest failing. The other game, Orgus, is based off a mecha anime and is one of the most basic shoot 'em ups ever. Just move and shoot. Oh wait, your robot can transform. I guess there's that. Hustle Chummy. Yeah, another game by Compile. Some Donkey Kong-esque game featuring a mouse. I'm not sure how to beat the level. There's fruit that the mouse needs to avoid. Get to the end of the stage and you're still on the same level. I guess not bad, just demanding more linearity. Now sometimes Sega would take SG-1000 games and release them as arcade titles, like Championship Boxing. It's an odd boxing game where you have to select the attack before making the attack. It's pretty frustrating, but it's notable for being the first game programmed by Yu Suzuki, one of Sega's most important figures, making many big arcade hits like Hang On, Outrun, Space Harrier, Afterburner, etc. Championship Soccer. It's choppy and lame and makes Nintendo Soccer look like Virtual Striker. And that's the most interesting titles of 1984 for the SG-1000. Before we get into the SG-1000 in 1985, let's take a look at some of the 85 games. 8 games sadly, but I'll get into the low count in a second. Most notably, Sega ported Zaxxon, which might have been the worst idea considering this hardware. It looks ghastly. But ports mostly dominated this year. Sega got to do a port of Space Invaders, and they do a better job than Toza did on the Famicom version. Star Force 2, and for the limitations of the SG-1000, Sega did a pretty good job. Even Konami gave Sega rights, including Hypersports, as we know as track and field in the West. Very different from the NES version, as it starts with this diving sequence which I can't figure out how to beat. Sadly, unlike the NES version, there is no level select. Too bad. Also from Konami, the really obscure game Shinyu Shien Torukun, released as Mikey in the West. So I think something's wrong with the programming. The point is to collect the hearts, but I can never seem to collect them. You have a move to shove your ass into their desk, but that doesn't seem to work either. And even as the game was programmed exceptionally, then we got the problem of the teacher chasing you down and these hearts flying by the screen too fast. Good lord. Also, what does this sound like?
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog.
Apparently the arcade game got the rights to use the Beatles songs. Well anyway, game's broken, moving on. Championship Pro Wrestling is a shameless rip-off of Championship Boxing, but absolute garbage. So I think the biggest problem with the SG-1000 is that it was released right at a time when video games were evolving. The SG's hardware is at its best with simple single-screen games that don't require shifting scenes. And I think Sega understood that too, and again decided to upgrade the hardware with the Sega Mark III. But this wasn't an upgraded model, it's a brand new system, eventually to be released in the West as the Sega Master System. Sega definitely took notes on what made Nintendo's console so impressive, and with modern graphics to boot, helped make the system stand out a lot more. The SG-1000 at its best could look like a Famicom game, but at its worst looked like a ColecoVision game. We'll talk about the Master System later on my channel, but I bring it up because included in the Mark III's hardware was the new Sega MyCard format, which plays games on little tiny cards. While the amount of RAM it could host was smaller, the manufacturing of the cards were much cheaper, and since no one was buying the SG-1000, you could still get games out on the cheap, and in 1985, more SG-1000 games were on cards instead of cartridges. 22 games, however some were re-releases. Bank Panic was an arcade game made into a mediocre SG-1000 game, where you have to save the bankers from robbers, and what was nice about the arcade game was it had 3 buttons for the 3-door situation. Here you only had 2, so sacrifices had to be made. Zoom 909 was also a Sega arcade game, but here is a really lame shoot 'em up that's making me fall asleep. Hang On 2, a sequel to Hang On, Sega's big motorbike arcade game. Well, more like sequel to the Master System version. That's right, a sequel on a less powerful hardware. But familiar titles include Chack and Pop, which actually had the cutscenes and tutorial levels missing from the Famicom version. Thanks for nothing, Toze. And Elevator Action, ironically better than the NES version. Bomb Jack is a name that might sound familiar. The arcade game got an NES sequel later in 1986. The SG-1000 got the original game, however, and it's pretty mediocre. Other ports include Sokoban, the very iconic Japanese block-pushing puzzle game, because what game platform didn't have Sokoban back in the day? Pitfall 2: The Lost Caverns, considered one of the last good Atari 2600 games. But I don't know, something feels lost here. Like this rope disappears when you walk up the ladder, and why do you fall down every hole instead of using the ladder? Also from Activision, Hero. I'd say a little better than Pitfall, it's got a nice sense of speed to it. Choplifter. We'll eventually see a port of this for the Famicom. And also from Broderbrunn, Troll, a lame game where you save kids. About as exciting as a game named Droll sounds. In terms of original titles, there's Dragon Wing, get your chuckles out now, and it's the poor man's Kung Fu Master. Dodging and countering the bosses in Kung Fu felt so simple, but here not so much. Doki Doki Penguin Land is a pretty infuriating puzzle game that really fits into the pre-Tetris genre. Mess up once and you gotta do it all over again. From Compile, it's Seesaw, an arcadey seesaw game. I'll admit, a game where you use seesaws to defeat your adversary sounds pretty cool, but here not so much, not fully realized. At least the seesaw animation is pretty good. By 1986, the SG-1000 was pretty much on its last legs, and I wouldn't be surprised if these are all leftover games being produced that needed releases. Sega was still pushing the MyCard format, so most of what little games there were published on the cards. Most interestingly, a port of Sega's arcade game Wonder Boy, which was ported to the NES by Hudson and his Adventure Island. And I do say interesting because holy hell, this is bad. Ninja Princess, not a terrible action game, but fuck whoever decided to put these 4 white ninjas here. But all the mediocrity is worth it in the end because we come to the best SG-1000 game, compiles Golka Cave, I guess. If you know compile for the shoot 'em ups, then this is exactly what you would expect. It has good speed, power-ups, and guess what it has? A life bar! Shoot 'em ups be praised, a life bar! I wouldn't say it's the best shoot 'em up ever, but it could go toe-to-toe against some of the more mediocre shoot 'em ups on the Famicom. Sega did manage to get out one last cartridge game, The Castle. It is the sequel to the game we know on the NES as Castle Quest. And like Castle Quest, I never liked how lackluster the frame rate was. And it's probably worse here. 1987 would have the last 2 SG-1000 games. Some game about Sherlock Holmes and the Black Onyx, a port of Bulletproof Software's dungeon crawler RPG. Yeah, while the Famicom got Dragon Quest II, a brand new title for their system, SG-1000 got an old 1984 RPG. And it's probably not the right system to play the Black Onyx on today. And that was the SG-1000, Sega's first venture into game consoles and computer systems. Needless to say, it hit shelves at the wrong time. Now to be fair, a lot of the library is pretty impressive with big name titles to sit on store shelves, but the Famicom and MSX were too strong and too popular for the console to keep up. For what it's worth, the SG-3000 was a little more successful and found some success in Europe and Oceania. And despite being a failure, the SG-1000 managed to find its way to New Zealand and Taiwan markets to sell around 2 million units. If you want an SG-1000 yourself nowadays, it's probably going to cost about a paycheck, with even a junk console costing $200. But sadly, the SG-1000 would also reflect some of the problems the Master System would eventually have. But again, I'll talk about that at another time. Stay tuned for the eventual return of FamiThon on my channel, or if you haven't watched it, give it a watch. And please have a great day.